Colin's Ghost by Nicholas Scott. He had seen the shadow every night for the past 3 months, and tonight was no exception. It was there once more, hovering beside the housecoat that hung loosely on the back of his door. It was waiting. Colin Layton hadn't yet fallen asleep. These days, that took him hours rather than the standard 7 minutes it took most. Instead, he pulled his duvet back to face the shadow. I'm not imagining this, he thought. Indeed, he was not, just as he had not been for many nights prior. At times, it seemed to occupy a shape, a figure standing, shifting its weight from side to side while it stood vigil in the dark. Other times, it seemed utterly formless. An intoxicating feeling of dread swept over Colin. It was a feeling he was all too familiar with, yet tonight it presented itself anew. Colin felt no fear. He felt nothing at all, in fact, devoid of any normal emotion or reaction. An ordinary person would see the shadow and release a scream loud enough to wake the entire apartment complex into a communal state of panic. But not Colin. He had become complacent. The ghost was there. So was he. It was with him. It was, in some strange way, a part of him. An urgent pulse in his lower abdomen brought his attention to the present, a place it rarely stayed for very long. He threw back the covers and spun around in bed. He looked to the door. The shadow loomed in the entrance. An exasperated sigh brought him to his feet, his body rising like dead weight on a pulley. He stumbled to the door and paid no heed to the specter. Instead, he moved with it, in tandem towards the bathroom. It lingered in the hall as Colin relieved himself, allowing him that privacy at least. Moments later, he was back in bed, the shadow resuming its nightly position, silent and stoic in the darkness of his room. It was another hour or two before he finally slept. In math, we have ways of presenting something less than zero, but in real life, there cannot be less than nothing. Colin's grade 4 class stared up at him, their bloodshot eyes straining through heads that hung back on poor posture. Thomas Nielsen was face down in a pile of drool at the front while Zach Hallahan carved his name into the corner of his desk with a metal ruler. They hate me, Colin assured himself. I would too. Colin clapped his hands together and forced a bright smile. He felt rather shameful doing it, like it was the most dishonest thing he could have done in front of 39-year-olds. All right, he said. I'm losing you guys. The class unanimously straightened their backs and shifted in their seats. Some of the kids coughed, realizing that they had been caught in their inattentiveness. No, that's all right. I'm boring, I get it. We've got 20 minutes left. How about we watch a movie? Cheers and eager applause as they jumped in their seats like puppy dogs eyeing a treat in their owner's hand. Another forced smile from Colin. He pulled the screen down, covering his utterly pointless scribbles on the chalkboard, and wheeled the projector over. They know I'm a fraud. I'm the worst teacher they've ever had. He turned it on. This is the 3rd time this week I'm playing a movie. Karen will pull me into her office and I'm done. I'll lose my job. They'll replace me with someone who can actually teach. As Colin sat at his desk, the kids suitably pacified with their digital babysitter, his attention drew to the door, where the shadow stood on the other side, facing him, its billowing form pulsating against the glass. It didn't always visit him at work, yet here it was. He needed a drink, a hard one. He didn't care how much he spent either. He didn't care about much. What's the point of going home? He knew what awaited him there. Leftover takeout and a seemingly endless night of TV binging and internet surfing. The biting January deep freeze didn't make him want to go anywhere. It didn't make him want to do anything. Might as well empty my wallet on the counter now. Colin sat at the bar of the Dominion, a somewhat seedy stop down the street from his school. Nothing about the bar itself was particularly run down. The atmosphere was decent, albeit mostly empty. They had your standard schedule of Wednesday night karaoke and live jazz Fridays. And their service was, all things considered, quite good. But the tables insistently smelled of potent vinegar, their cleaning solution of choice, and for Colin that took the Dominion down quite a few notches. He had been at the bar for nearly an hour, nursing his second double whiskey before he took notice of just how attractive his bartender was. He had seen her only once before while passing on his walk home. "How's your drink doing?" She looked up from wiping a glass, smiling. Oh, what a smile. "Yeah, it's good," he grunted. Idiot. The chatterbox inside his head refused to shut up, even at the most inopportune moments. "You work in the area?" she asked. She wants to talk to me. I teach down the street." Colin tried to make his voice sound more enthusiastic than he felt. He wasn't sure it had worked. "Very cool. What grade?" 4. Oof. Colin let out a forced laugh. "Yeah, it can be rough. They're good kids, though." "She is cute. Ask her out." "Who are you kidding? You're a loser with no social life." "That's not true. Ask her out." What's your name?" he asked in a sudden bout of word vomit. "Colleen." She smiled again. Colin and Colleen, Colin and Colleen, Colleen and Colin. Nope. Who cares? Do it. Ask her out. But Colin and Colleen. "I'm Colin." "Hey, we're name twins." She winked. Colin couldn't think of anything worse. Nor could he think of a response. So he raised his glass and mimed giving cheers. She laughed and went back to her work, serving another customer. The butterflies he felt in the pit of his stomach began to dissipate, and he knew in that moment he would not act on his feelings. He would finish his drink and leave. And I'll never come back to the Dominion again. He felt something approach from behind, grim and malignant. He didn't need to turn around. He knew what was there, and only he could see it. Sure enough, Colin had partaken in his nocturnal ritual of surfing the web and social media, mindlessly watching video bloggers profess their love for their followers while showing off their wealthy, put-together lives. He watched a good 4 hours of a sitcom he had never seen before, allowing the studio audience to laugh for him, and eventually went to bed at 3 a.m. He did so without showering. He always showered. On this night, he simply didn't feel like it. Colin tossed in his bed, rolling to one side and then the other. Glancing at the clock never helped, and yet he did it every 10 minutes. An involuntary pull to see if his insomnia was in check. It was. His inner chatterbox was running rampant. Images of the day flickered in his mind like an old-time movie, distorted and blurry. Colleen the bartender, beautiful and charming. She thinks I'm an idiot. He imagined what it would be like to lose his job. He saw the meeting with Karen. It's gonna happen. His students, young and impressionable. Mr. Layton sucks. And then he heard it. A creaking from the floor outside his room, a scratching at the door. He looked towards the sound and lay still. For a moment, he wondered if this was what paralysis felt like. He could see through the crack that something was there, and his energy drained. The doorknob turned, slowly. Whatever this thing was, it could have him. He had no will to fight back. The door groaned as it opened to reveal the shadow. It stood tall, floor to ceiling, as it wavered between this reality and the next, sometimes appearing solid and in the same breath translucent. Colin had expected to see it. He had sensed its presence long before it had manifested. But he felt no fear. He felt nothing. Why don't I feel anything? He sat up in his bed as the figure slid into the room. What do you want? Colin asked of it. The figure moved in response, a vaporous arm of sorts extending outward from its center and gesturing towards him. Take me then. All at once, the shadowy specter glided forward, and Colin slunk back in his bed, his duvet covering his chin. The figure dominated over him, and he felt himself slipping. His memories expanded farther and farther away from his consciousness. His sense of self became a cloudy mesh of random thoughts. The figure ascended and unfurled its ethereal arm, holding it above his face. Tears slid from the corners of Colin's eyes and soaked into the fibers of his pillow. Just take me. The shadow obliged, and for a brief moment, Colin thought he felt fear as the phantom arm reached forward and touched the space between his eyes. His eyes bulged and his veins constricted. He gagged and lurched in his bed, his back arching as the apparition penetrated his skin, reaching further and further, crossing the barrier of his skull until it was gone. It was weaving through his veins, traveling at a rapid speed. He felt it envelop his brain, and he collapsed on the mattress, exhausted and defeated. A mere 8 hours later, Colin sat at his desk, groggy-eyed, unsure if he had even slept. Surely he looked like hell. A movie played on the pull-down screen, and his class sat attentively. He didn't care about the repercussions. Fire me, he thought. I've hated this job anyway. In a strange way, he knew the thoughts were not his own, and he found himself, for brief moments at a time, able to observe them objectively, as though they were separate from him. And they were. They belonged to the demon. They always had. Colin found himself back at the Dominion later that night. He had no reason to go home, and yet no reason not to. His indecision had him stopping for a drink he didn't need nor really wanted. He felt tipsy already, and it was good and numbing. Colleen wiped a glass as she had the day before. How mundane. Long day? She asked. He shrugged, not looking up, and studied how the whiskey wrapped around the cubes of ice in his glass. Say something, Colin, that's rude. Need another drink? She continued. Colin looked at her and held up his glass, which was still half full. He jiggled it, the ice clanging against the sides. I think I'm good, he said, his voice dripping with stinging sarcasm. Colin, you're being rude. Colleen looked a little stunned. She shook her head and turned to a customer on the other side of the bar. Way to go, moron. Colin ignored the inner dialogue and turned back to his drink. He just wanted to be alone. He didn't want the girl. He didn't want any of it. Just leave me alone. He was back in his horrible apartment, parked on his awful couch, and watching the same stupid sitcom he had watched the night before. He hated it. It wasn't funny. He felt the entity move within him. It was thriving, taking hold of his moral compass and shattering it. He didn't care. 10 minutes went by, or maybe an hour. Time seemed inconsistent with the shadow inside him. His phone rang, startling him. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard his phone ring. It was foreign to him, like a sound entering the dream world that doesn't quite belong. He reached for it and took a deep breath, conjuring up the desire to answer. Hello. Colin, buddy, his best friend replied. Alex. Yeah, how you doing? I'm fine, he lied. The shadow jumped like a baby kicking in its mother's womb. It seemed to have traveled from his brain to the pit of his stomach, where Colin now carried it in solitude. I hadn't heard from you in a while, Alex continued. I wanted to check in. I know this time of year can suck. Colin was silent. The shadow recoiled. You doing okay? Alex asked. Yeah. Yeah, Colin said. I'm all right. Thanks. All right. Well, cool if I check in on you again, maybe tomorrow? Colin actually smiled, and for a moment, however brief, a rush of endorphins passed through him. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. He hung up. The shadow was writhing within him. It was growing restless. Colin stared at himself in the mirror. He hardly recognized the face he saw as he gripped the sides of the counter and glared into those eyes that hardly looked like his own. Get out, he said, out loud and seething. It tossed violently, shooting through him with a fire and loathing. Get out, he said louder. He felt it rise to his throat and he thought he might cry. He hadn't cried in so long. You don't belong. His grip on the counter tightened, so get out. Suddenly, Colin was flung forward. His stomach hit the counter as he gagged himself into a vomit. Only what came out was a billowing black cloud that splattered against the sink and mirror, pouring down the sides of the counter like a mist of dry ice. It shot out of him from every orifice. His mouth, his nose, his eyes, his ears. Tears coursed down his cheeks and he felt a rush of emotion return as the demon was exorcised. He fell to his knees and it reformed at his feet, towering above him. It hissed in rage, a banshee-like cry that made the walls shake. Colin covered his ears. He was weak but still managed to look up. Go away, he cried. It lurched back and roared, breaking into 1,000 pieces and flying in every direction. It was gone. The room was silent. Colin lowered his hands and gasped for air. Slowly, his breathing returned. Then, and without warning, he broke down, crying. He slept through the night for the first time in a long time. He had been aware of the shadow's presence, but it didn't bother him. He had defeated it once. He could do it again if need be. He understood that it would not be leaving him any time soon. He had accepted that. But he would be ready the next time it tried to take him. He had power over it, just as it seemed to have power over him. He could overcome it, no matter how close it got. So he allowed it to simply be, without judgment or reproach. He slept soundly, a deep sleep that had been missing from his life. In the corner of the room, the shadow remained. It would take him again. Yes, the first invitation it got. But it was fearful now, wary of its chances. It knew its time was at an end. Colin Layton had realized something few of its victims ever discovered. No matter how strongly it took hold, no matter how much energy it consumed, it was simply a shadow. Nothing more.